Okay, here's my audience. Hi, my name is Davidson, and today I wanted to talk about the Beatles. I wanted to focus more on the background information, some things that you may know, and some things you might not know. For the band members, so you have John Lennon on guitar, Paul McCartney on bass, George Harrison on lead guitar, and Ringo Starr on drums. They started out with different names. In '57, they had the Quarrymen, the Moondogs, and the Silver Beatles, but they eventually changed it to just the Beatles in '62. Also, they had different band members, which was Pete Best was their original drummer, and John's friend Steve Sutcliffe was the original bassist, but he eventually left, and Paul McCartney had to take over bass duties. So in '62, they met Ringo Starr from another band, and they added him and dropped Pete Best, and then they released their first single, Love Me Do. The Beatles first came to America in 1964, and they were heavily copied because of their success. Like, for example, the Rolling Stones copied them a lot. The Beatles came in '64, a year later the Rolling Stones came. The Beatles released a single, the Rolling Stones didn't even have one. And when the Beatles went psychedelic, the Rolling Stones ended up going psychedelic and started dressing up like wizards. So, just some information on some of the band members. John Lennon, he attended art school, but he eventually flunked out because he was considered to be a class clown, and I guess his focus just wasn't there. People didn't like John because they considered him a troublemaker. Even Paul McCartney's dad didn't like him and didn't want him hanging out with him. So Paul had to sneak out and hang out with John. But eventually his dad came around and he let them practice in his garage. So even the Beatles started out as a garage band. Paul McCartney had a job in a factory as a coil winder in '61, and he almost didn't even join the band because of that. He also, in the late '60s, Jimi Hendrix wrote Paul McCartney a telegram to form a supergroup with him, but Paul McCartney never got it. For George Harrison, he was 14 when he first auditioned for the Beatles, and John considered him to be a little too young for the part, but Paul urged him to give him a second audition, and they eventually accepted him. And also, George went to school with Paul, so that's how they became friends. And George was heavily influenced by Indian music, which you can tell in his songs that he wrote. For Ringo Starr, he started out in a band called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes in 1960, but he eventually joined the Beatles in '62, and his real name is Richard Starkey. So to conclude, the Beatles are considered one of the most successful bands in history, for numerous reasons. A few of them are they're the only band to hold the top 5 slots in the Billboard. They have the most #1 albums of all time, and they're just the best-selling band of all time. They also each had very successful solo careers after the band broke up in 1970. Also, just a fun fact to end on, Bob Dylan supposedly introduced them to marijuana back in the '60s, so he could be the reason for their psychedelic phase and why they had the future drug use. So, well, that's all I have. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.